Welcome, everybody. I'm Karen Monkman. I'm the president of CIES this year. And we are glad to have our second Honorary Fellows session of the year. The Honorary Fellows Award is given to some of our senior members of CIES who have reached certain achievements in the field and in the society. So we're glad to welcome Dan Wagner into that realm. I wanted to make just a short statement about Ukraine, since this session was planned way before anything is happening in the Ukraine. CIES is in the process of developing a statement, so you can keep a lookout for that. It's not developed yet, so I can't read anything, but we're all concerned about what's happening in that part of the world, as well as other parts where there's so much instability. So I'm going to begin by introducing Amy Jo Dowd, who is going to moderate this session, and then she will take it over from there. So Dr. Amy Jo Dowd is a graduate of Stanford and Harvard's graduate schools of education. In her career of over 3 decades, she has followed her passion for using rigorous research to innovate and improve practice in education and child development across the globe, initially and primarily with Save the Children. She then moved to the donor side, where she led the LEGO Foundation's distance learning response to the 2020 COVID pandemic. She's currently on sabbatical, looking at a number of options to continue testing and learning from ideas that promote learning at scale with equity. So Amy Jo, I'll turn it over to you, and we have a full session today, so.
Thank you so much, Karen. And I definitely echo your sentiments of solidarity and support for colleagues in and around the Ukraine and in the region. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for what we hope will be a very stimulating webinar. And it is, of course, my honor to welcome you and set the stage for a celebration of Professor Dan Wagner as an Honorary Fellow of the Comparative and International Education Society. Please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from. We have quite a number of people joining, and I'm not sure we all know each other, but that's a way to help us break all the ice. Our organization today, the plan is to first hear some stories and tributes from a number of Dan's colleagues and collaborators, after which we will let Dan get a word in too. Then we'll have 3 themes for discussion. The first is literacy and learning. The second is technology and education. And the third, partnerships and implementation. For those of you who know Professor Wagner well and his volume of work, you'll have no trouble recognizing that these are key areas of his contributions to our field. At any time during the session, please do add comments, kudos, stories, and questions into the chat, and I will do my best to incorporate them as we go. As moderator, I get the honor of introducing Dr. Wagner, who uses his broad interdisciplinary interests that span child psychology, anthropology, human development, technology, linguistics, and obviously comparative and international education to frame issues, apply expertise, convene colleagues, and to teach us all. What you may not know about is that Dan originally trained as an engineer at Cornell University, then served in the Peace Corps in Morocco before going on to receive his PhD in psychology at the University of Michigan. He taught or conducted research at Harvard, UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning, University of Geneva, and University of Paris, en route to his current and long-held position as Professor of Education and the UNESCO Chair in Literacy and Learning and Literacy at the University of Pennsylvania. Dan is founding director of not one, but 3 huge undertakings at the University of Pennsylvania: the International Literacy Institute, the National Center on Adult Literacy, and the International Educational Development Program, the Graduate School of Education. He has advised in veritable alphabet soup of international organizations, including UNESCO, UNICEF, USAID, DFID, now FCDO, as well as the organizations whose names we actually say, like the World Bank and others. He is a fellow of the APA, the AAA, the AERA in pursuit of his psychological, anthropological, and education research interests among societies of like-minded explorers. He's also the recipient of the 2014 UNESCO Confucius International Literacy Prize. Through all of these appointments, accolades, and administrative feats, there are 4 areas of effort that I admire in Dan's work and want to speak to briefly. That he frames key issues, applies his expertise, convenes colleagues, and teaches us all. Dan has produced seminal scholarship that frames our work. He frames it in literacy, in learning, in information and communications technology, and in equity. So whether I'm reading his book, Learning as Development, Rethinking International Education in a Changing World, or perusing his piece on smaller, quicker, cheaper learning assessments, or browsing through book number 1 and from last week, book number 2 on learning at the bottom of the pyramid, I am taking in work that has helped to shape decisions in classrooms, in boardrooms, and in ministries alike. These works frame the issues for both students of and professionals in the international education sector. Dan applies his expertise, not one to publish and simply not perish in academia. He is actively pursuing opportunities to link theory and practice, regularly searching out perspectives from across donors, academia, multilaterals, and NGOs in pursuit of greater understanding of key topics. He leads collaborations with colleagues on collections of ideas, serving as editor, cheerleader, taskmaster to disparate voices to bring out the nuances with which we need to grapple. Having been in on several of these collaborations over the years, I can attest to his persistent pursuit of quality in all 3 of these roles: editor, cheerleader, and certainly taskmaster. And Dan is also a convener. His active engagement in policy, planning, evaluation, and technical assistance is clear through not just the aforementioned alphabet soup, but also the many meetings that he coordinates and the key panels that he plans and often chairs. Whether on CIES's Social and Policy Engagement Committee or by launching and promoting tirelessly, as we know, both special interest groups and unique panels, Dan brings people and ideas together. From inviting me to join a group of literacy experts traveling around Tunisia in the mid-90s, to including me just a few years back at a dinner table in DC discussing how to better understand and tackle educational equity, I have grown, as I'm sure many of you have, from being involved in Dan's convening efforts. And finally, and perhaps most of all, Dan is a teacher, a passionate educator who has been a mentor to many scholars across academia and many program leaders across the international education community. From my earliest years in the industry, he was always quick with a word of support and advice, as well as not a few links for further reading. And even though I never studied with him, he graciously supports me in endeavors to bridge the academic and non-academic nature of our work. He does this with current students too, inviting them to events, linking them to colleagues, bringing colleagues to his classes, and supporting everyone's growth. This has been a model of how to support others' learning that I've been inspired to follow. So Dan frames, Dan applies, Dan convenes, and Dan teaches. And in so doing, he has influenced us all. And it is my honor to have the first word today and be the first to thank him for his many contributions. And now I would like to hear from my many colleague nominators and others who can round out my perspective, hopefully tell us some tales. I will ask you all to keep it to 3 minutes maximum, but if you get there, you will see my gently swaying thumbs up. First up is Nathan Castillo, Assistant Professor at the University of Illinois. Take it away, Nathan.
All right, thanks, Jo. As you mentioned, my name is Nathan Castillo. I'm an assistant professor in global studies and education at the University of Illinois, focusing primarily on technology innovation in education research and design. I first met Dan in 2012 as his PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania. And I want to share one anecdote from my experience with him as his mentee at that time. So to begin, the best way that I can describe Dan is as a dedicated mentor and passionate educator. Having worked throughout Latin America on various projects with Education Development Center prior to coming to Penn, I arrived to campus with a pretty good idea about where I wanted to focus my efforts over the next several years. However, Dan had something to say about that. I remember sitting down with him in his office during my first semester to have a meeting about my academic plan and conversation quickly turned to a discussion
about breadth versus depth of study. Can you still hear me?
We can still hear you, but we can't see you any longer.
Sorry about that. Breadth versus depth of study and how I should use my time as a doctoral student to help shape my future career goals. It was through that discussion that I decided to broaden my regional and technical expertise and focus. This focus shifted my intention and my interest to working with him on an all children reading study, investigating language, literacy, and technology in rural South Africa, in collaboration with our local counterpart, Motino Institute. This setting became my second home over the next several years and ultimately the basis of my research for my dissertation, as well as my current line of inquiry as a faculty member. And I'll just say that it's that careful and prescient guidance that Dan's breadth of knowledge brings to his mentoring relationships and was the first of many lessons that I've gained from him over the years. Also, if you've ever taken a course with Dan, his breadth of experience that he draws on to pepper his lectures is also how he can make any academic topic as equally entertaining as it is educational. And so it's no wonder that when I was putting together his candidacy dossier, there was overwhelming support from everyone I contacted. And we'll hear from several of them next. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Now, next on my list, I have Stephen Heinemann, Professor Emeritus at Vanderbilt University, but I'm not sure he's got connectivity. If you're on the line, send up a flare. I haven't seen him yet. If not, we'll proceed to Joshua Muskin. Take it away, Josh.
Hi, everybody. It's lovely to see you. I'll try to get this done before you start waving frantically at me, Amy Jo. So Dan's been helping me be a better professional for about 40 years now. He was my kindergarten teacher. No. So we've been through a lot for 40 years, beginning with my academic career, but I feel like Dan's been the guide, both the guiding force and the guiding lamp to move towards for all these 40 years, and putting me into a lot of situations where I was like, why is he doing this? So early on, having me help organize meetings here at Penn. I'm actually sitting at Penn right now, Dan. And meeting people like Mansour Ahmed and Philip Koons and people that I was reading about and were people I was aspiring to and motivating me to get into this profession. And of course, supporting me in my thesis and supporting me in a thesis that I don't necessarily think he entirely got at the beginning, and probably because I didn't entirely get what I was doing at the beginning of the process. So he helped me navigate all that. And I think at the end, we both understood a little bit where we were, and it pointed me in the direction where I am now. He's been a great advocate, advisor, and a colleague since, and perhaps most fun was in the, when was it, 2010, 2015, when I was leading a USAID project in Morocco, where Dan was one of the senior advisors, and did something remarkable in literacy, where he got the minister responsible for literacy and the head of the Amazek Institute to agree on a very novel approach to adult literacy, where we got them to agree to teach women to read in Amazek using the Arabic script, which was nothing that I think anybody else on the planet could have accomplished in happening. And then perhaps most satisfying is that Dan has been not just a professional colleague and friend, but a family colleague and friend, and to me and my whole family, and him and his whole family. Hi, Mary. Hi, Claire. Hi, Jonah. Nice to meet you, Josh. Have been friends for below these nearly 40 years as well. So it's, Dan, it's a real pleasure to be able to celebrate all your accomplishments for the society and for the field of education, and also your accomplishments on my behalf as a professional and as a person. So I thank you very much for this chance to share.
Well done, Josh. Thank you so much. Right under the wire, time-wise. We're going to go to Moses Okech, a professor at the University of College London Institute of Education. Moses.
Thank you, Amy Jo. I hope everyone can hear me okay, all the way from the UK. And it's such a great pleasure to be here today and to see so many of you. Hi, everyone. And to see Dan. I'm not really sure how much I can say. I mean, Dan is basically a great professor. That's the way to summarize it. I've met so many professors, both in the UK and the US, where I got trained at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And Dan is one of my best. We've collaborated in a number of projects in terms of learning, but also, as Amy Jo said, Dan is a great convener. I just don't know how he's able to draw people together. I just, it's a gift Dan has, ability that is when Dan sends an email, everybody says yes, and I don't know how he manages to do that. And it's difficult to turn Dan down because of the way he writes his email, the way he follows up things. So I would say that for me, working with Dan has been wonderful. In terms of just a brief note, I mean, I met Dan about a decade ago now, I would say, or more than a decade ago, in terms of in person, but I'd known Dan's work before that for a long time. But we started working closely around 2011 or 2012. Dan invited me to be a visiting professor at UPenn, and I taught 2 MA courses there, which I enjoyed very much. But I also got to know Dan very well during that time, and from there we carried on our collaboration, starting with the learning at the bottom of the pyramid when he convened a group of us at UPenn, where we discussed what became the book that Amy Jo referred to as LBOP1. And that LBOP1 kept going and it never stopped. Then we ended up with LBOP2. I mean, the most interesting bit around LBOP1, I think so. I was in India. I was traveling. I'm at the airport in India. Dan had sent me an email and I'd not read the email. I mean, I think I read it, but I said, oh, I think I'll reply to this when I get back to London. Then I get a call on my phone. And then I see it's Dan. I said, should I pick this? Should I not pick it? Then I decide to pick it. And then I said, Dan, I'm at the airport. I'm just traveling to London now. I'm in Delhi. And Dan says, Moses, look, I need you to be on this panel. These ideas you're sending me about LBOP, exactly these things you're saying, I need you to be able to put them together and then let's talk. And I said, what a dedication. Dan is willing to look me up when I'm traveling all over the world. We spoke for about 5 minutes, but it just showed me how dedicated and the friendship he has when he actually talks you through anything. And then I was working with David, seconded there briefly as a senior research fellow, and during that period for about 2.5 years, I worked with Dan on LBOP2. And his dedication to learning at the bottom of the pyramid and focusing on how to improve education for marginalized populations across the world is something that speaks to itself. So I don't want to say more. I think I just want to say I was very pleased that Dan was nominated for this fellowship. I'm so pleased to be here to celebrate Dan's academic accomplishments. He's a great professor, actually, a great intellectual, a great professor, somebody who is willing to build other people, but also a great collaborator. He listens, he can challenge you, he will always smile, and he will give you his bit. But Dan is a great listener. It's just nice to work with Dan. I've worked with many people, but I just find him to be somebody that I enjoy naturally working with. Let me stop there. And Dan, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak about your work. Thank you, Amy Jo.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to veer a little bit from our planned order, those of you who are waiting in line, and I'm going to call Luis Crouch, who has messaged me that he's not feeling well, but wants to have a quick word before he needs to go rest. Luis, over to you.
Thanks. Not feeling well is a bit of an understatement. I need to go rest, seriously. So I'm just I barged into the line just to say a few words, and then I'm gonna go to bed. I can't actually remember when I met Dan, but I can remember when I heard about him, which was from one of his students whom I had just hired into RTI, Jenny Spratt. In a way that's symbolic of one of the things I really value, and I think we all admire about Dan. He may be a better networker than a professor, and maybe a better networker than a scholar. Dan's connections are absolutely astounding. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why he's such a good professor and colleague and mentor, is because he has a really good sense for what's going on in the world because of his amazing connections. And also, I think it's what allows him to be, to use a very hyper modern term, such an influencer. And to highlight the degree of influence, I would say Dan was directly causal in maybe 2 out of the top 5 professional accomplishments of my life. So I am enormously grateful to him for that. And we can talk about what those were later, Dan. So just to end before I go crash, here's a health shake, which is what I mostly eat these days. And I'll raise a toast to Il Miglior Fabbro. And you can ask me where that quotation is from later on. It means the better craftsman.
Thank you so much, Luis.
Thanks.
Okay,
I'm gonna log off now. Thanks.
rest well. I hope you feel
Thank you.
better. Now we're going to turn it over to Ben Piper, the Director for Global Education Program at the Gates Foundation. Ben?
Thanks, Amy Jo. And hi, Dan, and congratulations on this recognition of your work. I have 3 things to say, and I hope the internet cooperates. I've turned off all other programs. I'm calling from my beloved Ethiopia. My first point is just to say that Dan, though he is all the things people have said so far, he also legitimately cares about people. And my experience with that is that every year at CIES, this is a CIES Honorary Fellow. I want to talk about CIES. So every year at CIES, we'd have a chat, and he would make time, though he had so many students and so many other people around, he would make time to reach out to me, and we'd talk every year. We met in Zambia at a conference. We met at his house in Mount Airy. We met at my house in Nairobi. And I'm just want us to remember in this kind of world of productivity that Dan is an example of someone who actually cares about people and makes time for them personally. These were chats about my career. There were chats about vision for the future and big picture things, and not everyone would take that much time so consistently. My second comment is just, again, about CIES, that I distinctly remember being, I think I was a grad student, where there was a presentation, a panel that Dan was on Edtech. I think Nathan was also there when he was in grad school. I just remember it was the promise of Edtech in both South Africa and Morocco. I think Dan spoke about some of the work he had done in Morocco a long time ago. And I think what I remember from that, which is also kind of part of what I'm thinking about now, I'm working on an Edtech kind of concept note for what we might want to do in the sector, that kind of idea of both the possibility, but the criticism, the care and the precision, and mixing the hope of our sector with the critical view of what's really possible in the reality of schools that Dan had seen in South Africa and Morocco and many countries all over the world through his experience. So that kind of hope, possibility mixed with reality. And I don't think many scholars have that mix as well established as Dan. So my third point is actually, again, about CIES and about scholarship. I think the thing I would just like to say is that Dan has consistently worked on and produced things that people want to read. When you do the Google Scholar and you count the number of citations, that's one thing, but actually having things that are influential, ideas that are meaningful, that drive the sector. I think Amy Jo talked about smaller, quicker, cheaper, learning is development, LBOP. There's areas in the international education sector where Dan's intellectual view and thoughts and scholarship have influenced and pushed the sector in ways that it needed to go. And so I think it's a good example for us to make sure that our ideas are ones that are at the forefront of the sector, but also ideas that connect to the future, but connected to classroom realities. So thanks, Dan, and congratulations on this award. It's well deserved.
Thank you so much, Ben. We turn now to David Post, Professor and Senior Scientist of Education at Penn State University. David?
David, you're on mute.
I'm listening with envy to the participants in the discussion who had the benefit of knowing Dan personally, because maybe this is a counterpoint, but I'm one of the people who is a great admirer of Dan, basically on paper and for what he's done. I think I had one dinner with him one-on-one in Mexico City a few years ago. I have spoken with him on the phone, but I admire Dan, and I'm very moved to hear everybody say, but I have, I guess, a professional or intellectual relationship with his ideas more than with him as a person. So I think that the person is actually more important than the ideas. But I'll talk about what I know, which is his impact on CIES and the field. I would say that something that Peter Easton and I wrote in our book review a couple of years ago is worth underscoring, which is that Dan's work is synthetic, ambitious, audacious, and attempts to be comprehensive in a way that this field has not seen for a long time. The parallel that I drew was the book that I read in graduate school, Ingemar Fagerlund and Lawrence Saha, Education and Development. I mean, that's the scope of what he has tried to do in his work. And it's much more risky than what probably I've done and what many other people I know and admire have done, which is like narrowly talk about one or two things, but to try to comprehend everything, to try to imagine a learning Gini index, to try to imagine all the non-economic benefits of education and put it all together is really audacious. I also wanted to say that okay, I'm just going to stop really quickly, but I want to go back to something that Amy Jo actually said in her introduction. She was listing a long list of professional accomplishments and background that Dan had, starting with engineering and making all kinds of important contributions to linguistics and cognitive psychology. And then she said, and obviously comparative education. And I want to problematize that because it's not obvious that Dan would have come into this field. I think that now I'm going to make a comment like Ben just did, not just about Dan, but about our field, because I think for many of the last few years, I've been like a cranky kind of person talking about how porous and how little boundary there is in comparative education. But now that I think about it in my old age, I think it's actually very admirable. Dan, in his very self-effacing way, when I brought up the history of CIES at UPenn and talked about Bill Brickman, Dan said, yeah, I think I met Bill Brickman just as he was going out the door. I saw him a couple of times, but I didn't really know him. And here's Dan, a very distinguished professor who people consider to be an expert in comparative education, saying, I don't really know that much about Bill Brickman. And yet the field has been such that it's welcome, not just welcome, it's attracted superstars like Dan to it. And for that, we can thank not just Dan, but we can sort of thank ourselves so it's not obvious that he would have come into our field, but I'm very grateful, I know we all are, that Dan has done that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for your perspective. Next, we go to Sylvia Schmelkis, the director of the Mexican National Institute for Education. Sylvia, or Educational Evaluation, excuse me.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate Dan on his very well-deserved recognition as Honorary Fellow of CIES, which is an institution in which he has participated intensely over a number of years and through which much of his work has been made known and discussed. Dan's work has always been a reference for me. We have traveled similar paths. Literacy in adult education has also been my field of research, especially during the 70s and 80s. And Dan's struggle against illiteracy, as well as that of the institutions that he built at the time Paulo Freire's approach to literacy was made known and accepted throughout the developing world and beyond, were a very important cornerstone for the relatively small adult education researchers community around the world. Dan is an internationalist and as such has had an enormous impact on the way we visualize the relationship between education and development. UNESCO has picked up on his seminal proposals, and Dan's work has been important in shaping the way many scholars, as well as politicians and activists, understand this relationship. In this area, he has also been key to my work in the critique and proposal of educational policy in my country, which is Mexico, by the way. His interests in deepening the world's knowledge on learning, especially of those in low and middle income countries, and those who have been left behind, has led him to have a strong say in how to approach learning assessment in a sharp and efficient way. He has helped shape my work and that of many others in the field. And finally, I have had the opportunity of being invited by him to participate in the 2 phases of learning at the bottom of the pyramid, which Dan envisioned and has led in the very recent years. The basic insight that working for the improvement of learning of those who are learning little or not at all is the best way towards improving the quality of entire educational systems has had my mind spinning for the past few years, thinking of a project centered on good pedagogy for the most marginalized and searching for ways of making education relevant to indigenous peoples. I hope I will be able to work on such a project with his guide and advice in the near future. And finally, a short word on Dan as a person. He is dialogical in his proceedings. Not only is he open to different viewpoints, he actively goes out to find them. He is affable, generous, responsive, and an excellent friend. So congratulations again, Dan, for this recognition to your seminal work that has transformed traditional approaches to educational policy and practice, serving most marginalized children, youth, and adults around the world. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Next up, we have Mohamed Mahmoud, a veteran co-lead, now retired, of many International Literacy Institute collaborations with Dan. Mohamed?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Amy, and congratulations, Dan. Glad to see Claire, Jonah, and Mary. So I think I also belonged in that family. Talking to you about Dan Wagner today is like telling you why I left Tunisia in 1995 and came mid-career to the United States of America to completely change my whole professional and personal life. I first met Dan when he, quite an authority already on literacy and education, came to visit me at the Bourguiba Institute of Modern Languages in Tunis sometime in the late 80s. We talked about the spread of illiteracy in the Arab region, and he told me about his interest in Madrasa Islamic education. In the summer of 1990, I returned his visit, and we talked about the importance of partnerships and how university could and should help with providing high-level research and better solutions to the nagging problems of illiteracy in the world. I left convinced of 2 things. One, that universities should be more involved in adult literacy work, and 2, that they should partner and work together to provide the research and training that local adult literacy programs need so urgently. At that time, Dan's big idea was to try to get some funding for the creation of an African university network focused on promoting more research and training in adult literacy. Dan was successful in getting a 5-year grant from USAID, and the Literacy Training and Development Program for Africa, the LTDPA, was born in 1990. And basically, that was the beginning of the most interesting, really set of activities in that I, participated in from Tunis. The whole idea of the LTDPA was Dan's, and he convinced the university to create this partnership between the University of Pennsylvania and 3 other universities from Africa: the University of Tunis, the University of Gaborone in Botswana, and the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. And after that, we had a wonderful set of activities in Philadelphia meetings in Tunis, Ibadan, even in Cape Town. These activities were noticed by UNESCO, or at least UNESCO was made aware of those activities, and therefore that led to the funding for another 5 years by UNESCO and PEN of the International Literacy Institute. I had the real honor and privilege to be invited by Dan to come, leave everything in Tunisia and come to become the co-director of the ILI with him. I would not tell you about what followed, because what followed is a whole set of activities, meetings. Dan is absolutely wonderful in being able to make people convene, and I heard this from all of you. He is also wonderful in being, in a way, the glue that connected institutions, and that led to a huge amount of really discussions and improvement. All of us improved when we talked together, sat down and talked together about these issues that really are difficult to deal with by ourselves. During my time at ILI, there are so many anecdotes, and I can't even open that part, because there is so much to tell about Dan and how we spent time together. The only thing I can say is that I learned a lot from Dan about literacy and education. But more than that, we really greatly enjoyed and appreciated each other's company. I also learned that you never had enough time to get bored when you work with Dan Wagner. The 6 years I spent with him at the ILI were the shortest and most enjoyable years of my long professional career. Thank you very much, Dan. And I know that this friendship is going to last as long as we can just call each other or meet. Congratulations again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed. And our final speaker before Dan gets in word in is Serena Bokova, former Director General of UNESCO. Serena?
Thank you very much, Amy. I'm so happy to be here to celebrate Dan Wagner, and I would say to celebrate the importance of education, of learning, of the international cooperation, and also to see so many respected experts, friends of UNESCO, because I just joined and I heard about UNESCO's contribution. And of course, in my capacity as a former Director General, I could only thank once again Dan for all his support that he has given to the organization well before I was elected. And I think it's a great privilege now to speak about his contribution to the United Nations generally. It is not only that Dan is a UNESCO chair, which is of course very important. I would say that he's a thinker. He's someone who constantly develops this idea that education is the foundation of human development. And in all his work about literacy, in his books, he has emphasized the importance of international cooperation. Dan was one of the main drivers behind the United Nations Decade of Literacy. He experts and academics, and I would say also participating in many projects, contributing to the adoption of Gender Sustainable Development 2030, participating in a number of brainstorming sessions and inscribing literacy, learning literacy is something fundamental. I can continue talking because we have been during the 8th of September, the International Literacy Day, so many times in New York at UNESCO. I was privileged to be part of the launching of his last book, Learning Development. It is so important, summing up all the international cooperation, all the experience that is there during this time. And I would like just to quote, because he has said many important things, and I have learned also a lot from him. But he said something really important in one of the deliberations that I would like to say, and to end with this, when he said that literacy helps to empower people and create more informed citizens who are vital to address the problems associated with building more sustainable societies. And then he gave examples from the rural farmers, better farmers, if they have been to school, just as educated people are better able to understand key health messages, and educated mothers pass on their health learning to their children. I think with all this, this is exactly then committed, passionate, strong message and advocacy. So once again, congratulations, Dan, well deserved. Proud to be here with all of you this evening here in Europe, during the day there, and please continue being that committed and supporting UNESCO and all the international community in promoting education. So vital now after COVID-19. We need really thank you.
Thank you so very much. Dan, now it's over to you. Dan, you're on mute.
Oh, yeah, I just got off mute. Well, I've seen other people in, I should say, sessions like this where we're honoring other people. And I have to say, being on the receiving end is really a different experience. So I'm touched and moved. I did write down a few words I'd like to share with you, but I have to say I am, as we see over here, bowled over by what people have said and the generosity of colleagues and friends over the years. Let me start by saying that it's deeply touching personally to hear what you have said in this online event. There are so many reactions I have to what individuals have said. I don't have time even to begin that, but just to say that I am so grateful for those of you who have stayed up late or getting up early to join this call, whether you're here around in the US or in Paris or London or Canberra or Bangkok or Kyoto or Johannesburg or elsewhere. I know people come from very far away for this call. Fortunately, we're on Zoom. I'm also pleased to see a number of my Penn students on this call as well. So thank you for joining in. I guess I should begin formally by thanking the CIES and its president, Karen Monkman, and our moderator, Jo Dowd, for organizing the event today. I am indeed humbled to receive this honorary award from CIES. It is very meaningful to me. CIES has been an intellectual home, and in sort of building on what David Post said, when I got to Penn, I never had even heard of CIES. And so the transition to become an intellectual home for me was, in fact, a fairly large transition in my career. And I am so glad that I did. It has been a community for me for decades now. And I am myself grateful for all the innumerable chats and coffees and conversations and panels and networking moments, to channel a little bit what some of you said, including Luis Grouch. I never thought of it as being so extraordinary, but it certainly was fun. And it always was interesting. And my own learning and my own career are integrally related to my involvement with CIES and my CIES friends. So thank you for that. I also need to thank my professional home. I've been many years at the University of Pennsylvania at its Graduate School of Education. And Penn has, as I think some have said, supported me through a number of important academic and research transitions, both by sort of the category of what I was doing and the disciplinary dimensions. I started out in child and human development. That was my initial position. I moved more seriously into educational psychology, eventually into adult literacy as well, then into educational technology, going back to some of my roots in technology as an engineer. And all along the way threaded through this has been a strong interest in learning and literacy, both in this country, the United States, and internationally. Some of you may have noted, members of my family are on this call, and I want to thank them too, especially my wife, Mary, and my children, Jonah and Claire, and my son-in-law, Josh. I don't know how to make this in the balance sheet of pros and cons, but at times I drag them all to places they might not have been top on their list. But I think at the other side, we've all benefited from, all of us probably on this call, from being dragged to places we hadn't intended to go to, but profited from in all kinds of personal and social ways. So thank you for being with me on this path. So you've heard from Amy Jo that there will be Q&A with several colleagues in just a bit. I want to start, if I may, with just a couple of minutes on what I think this substantively, what this webinar is about. You know, if you remember when you registered, that it actually had a name, and it was called, that is, the webinar had a name. It was called Learning as Development, Past and Future. Several of you have spoken about this in your own comments, but let me just take a minute to say that this is around a book that came out a few years ago, Learning as Development, where I made a proposal that had been long percolating in my mind. It seemed maybe a little bit risky, is maybe the way to term it, that my work in human development and the work in international development were really one and the same. I hadn't thought about it that way, even though I was actually, I think, doing that. I was walking the walk, but I couldn't really bring myself to talk the talk until I put some time into this book called Learning as Development. And in that book, I had a number of takeaways, and I'm just going to list a few of them for you. What led me to call the book what it is and to still advocate for some of its ideas. The first is pretty obvious to us now, and that is that learning is something that happens across the lifespan, from infancy to older age. Now, people who do psychology and child development, human development, we've known that for a long time, but it's now more embedded into, I think, international development than it was before. In many ways, learning is development, the development of human capabilities. Another point is that all learning is local. You may have heard that. Remember, Tip O'Neill, the famous congressman, said all politics is local. Well, that influenced me in an odd way over time to think that, in fact, all learning is local too. It's in our heads, of course, but it's also incredibly context sensitive, not just in schools. Much of what we learn today, and maybe increasingly so, happen outside the school, whether you're children or adults, whatever. One only needs to mention technology, which I think we'll get to a little later on in the conversation. And finally, and as always, metrics for learning are important. Many of us know about these metrics. Many of us have been judged by metrics in order to get into college, into university, onto this call at some point in their lives. And there's this famous phrase that you may have heard: if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. And that's a simple phrase, but it has deep meaning. And it also is true that all metrics are not created equal. So that just because we have some metrics that we might think are important from an international perspective doesn't mean they work at a local perspective. So those are some of the ideas that brought together this book and brought together this idea that the two developments, as I call them, one is human development, the other is international development, are really have common roots and are complementary concepts. So to me, as I see it, most of my career has been trying to figure out how those two pieces of development fit together. And I think I've been very fortunate that in many ways, and maybe this is Irina alluded to this, and that is, I think they've been influential in some parts of the UN conversations, in part because the UN has also figured out that this is important. And so my career, and to some extent that of UNESCO, have followed similar pathways, though sort of serendipitously, not necessarily by design. In any case, my sense is that this future we have of trying to achieve greater equity in education and in learning is making progress. It's a difficult task, and I'm glad to be part of it with all of you. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Amy Jo.
Thank you so much, Dan. And a great introduction to where we're headed next, which is 3 different sections, as I mentioned, of some of the big ideas that Dan has pursued. He just gave us a great introduction to the first section, which Sylvia will lead us in, called Literacy and Learning. Take it away, Sylvia.
Yes, thank you very much, Amy Jo, and thank you for these words, Dan. I think we all feel very reflected in what you have said. But I would like to ask you about the beginning of your incursions in education, I think it was, that has to do with literacy. How did you become interested in learning and in literacy?
So I'll give you a short version. As I think Amy Jo mentioned right up front, I did study engineering as an undergraduate, but she may not have known, my family knows, that I was in the footsteps of my father and grandfather, who were both engineers. That was the family expectation. And so when I started courses at Cornell University as an undergraduate, I was plodding along in this area until I started taking some classes in the social sciences. And all of a sudden, they grabbed my attention more than my slide rule. I don't know if people know what a slide rule is anymore, but it was the precursor to other electronic devices to know how to make calculations. So we all carried slide rules, but one of my professors there was a man some of you will have heard of, is Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who was a very well-known by that time psychologist, developmental psychologist, who taught about cultural differences in child rearing and education around the world. And I went to some of his classes, and he was an early influence. But then I took off, as I think you mentioned. I spent 2 years in Morocco as a Peace Corps volunteer, building canals in rural Morocco as an engineer. So I was still, there's a whole story to that too, but the short form is that it was a pivotal time in my life, as it is for many people who go to Peace Corps. And when I came back to the United States to pursue graduate training, even though I was an engineer in Morocco, I came back interested in culture, social sciences, and anthropology. And being the 60s, they kind of let you do a little bit more of what you would want to do than they did in earlier years, and maybe even what they do now. So I went into a doctoral program at the University of Michigan in child development, child psychology. And I had one of my first kind of epiphanies, and that was that I was just surprised at the insularity of Western-based research at the University of Michigan that have been doing this kind of work for a long time, that they were trying to understand learning based on how middle-class white kids, mainly at that time, were learning in school, and how even Jean Piaget was looking at Genevan kids learning how to learn in Switzerland. And I thought, well, what about Moroccan kids? What about other places in the world? Does everybody learn in the same way? So this is a very early recognition that this was going to be something that I would care about. I was lucky, however, that a well-known psychologist, child psychologist, Harold Stevenson, some of you may know the name, had just arrived on campus, and I became his first student. And he was developing a team to work on culture and child development, and I was able to join that team. And as part of that work, I went off to Yucatan, Mexico, to work on a project whose head was Michael Cole, out of Rockefeller University, and where he was looking at cross-cultural differences in children's cognitive development in children who had been to school or had not been schooled in Yucatan. After that, I returned to Morocco for my dissertation research, field work in areas where I had worked earlier. Remember that canal building? Well, I made friends in that area when I was there building canals, and those friends were still there. And fortunately, they helped me gain access to schools and leadership and so on. And I was able to do some work for my dissertation that involved, again, the issue of schooling and learning, and also a first contact with Islamic education, which turned out to be an important part of what I would be doing in some of the years later. After getting my dissertation, I went to the Penn's Graduate School of Education, and that has been my home. But shortly thereafter, I was off again to Harvard's Graduate School of Education to work with Robert Levine, an anthropologist, and Jean Shaw, an education researcher who is a specialist. You may know of her work in the field of reading. She was quite well known. And they both said, you know, there's real work to be done out there, building on your previous skills. We'd like to influence you in what you're going to be doing. So, and they did. And so after their inputs into my intellectual life, I undertook work in Indonesia, Yemen, Senegal, Egypt, and then landed on a multi-year project with Jenny Spratt as my first student on that. And Jenny's on this call today, work that we did together. So that's sort of the beginning of the literacy work without moving much further at that point, Sylvia. That's a brief entree, if you will, into the literacy work that I've done.
Fascinating, Dan, and it explains your intercultural outlook towards development and learning, and it's very, very interesting, this background that you have given us. And another question that I wanted to ask you, because just last week, your new edited book with Nathan Castillo and Sue Grant-Lewis came out. It's called Learning, Marginalization, and Improving the Quality of Education in Low-Income Countries Learning. How does this book fit in with your work in Learning at the Bottom of the Pyramid initiative?
Right, well, thanks. Well, this comes from another kind of set of experiences. And this is one, I guess, one of the, let me start with this. Back in 1990, I'd already been on the faculty at Penn for, almost 15 years. I was asked, fortunately, by Wadi Haddad, another well-known name, if you're familiar with the education leaders at the World Bank. Wadi Haddad at the World Bank invited me to participate in the early planning of the World Conference on Education for All in Jamtien, Thailand. To me, this was an eye-opener, even to be invited to be part of that. It was an eye-opener. It was an occasion for me, I think, to understand how the work that I was doing as an academic could actually be a central goal of the United Nations. I was actually completely surprised that what I had been trained to do in my, I would say, smaller world as an academic was all of a sudden central to what people were trying to write up as a plan that would eventually become first the Millennium Development Goals around education, and then the Sustainable Development Goals. And this, for me, happened with that experience at in the planning of the World Conference back in Jamtien. And it made me also realize that there was not just, I would say, the route of the usual publications that people did when they, like me, were young academics, but there were important issues at the policy interface where our work could be taken more seriously, or we could be pushed to do different work because what they became, these UN Sustainable Development Goals, push us in different directions. We may be influential to them, but they are certainly influential to us. So that was a major start toward what you, Sylvia, were referring to in terms of both the second LBOP book called Learning, Marginalization, Improving the Quality, but also getting going on the idea of learning at the bottom of the pyramid. And at the time, at the same time as that Jomtien conference was happening, we received a major federal grant at the university, and Mohamed Mahmoud also showed up around that same time, 1990, when we established the first U.S. National Center on Adult Literacy. It was an R&D center funded by the U.S. Department of Education. It gave us enough resources to be able to think creatively, what would you do to improve functional literacy in the United States? This is an enormous task. It still is an enormous task. And we were the first center of its kind. But as we were developing that center, we were also with Mohamed thinking about this literacy training and development program for Africa, and thought, it's not enough to have a U.S. center on national, a U.S. national center on literacy. We really need to have an international center. And we created then, a few years later, the International Literacy Institute, and we're able to network again with UNESCO to provide co-funding and co-planning for that ILI, as we call it, the International Literacy Institute. And this would look not just at adult literacy issues, but literacy across the lifespan, which is again, sort of part of my long-term human development, lifespan issues and human development approach. And in the years that followed, we had conferences and planning sessions all over the world, very exciting effort in the United States as well. So moving forward from those experiences, when we got to the UN, the first set of UN Millennium Development Goals, which was, I guess, the year 2000, and now we have the new Sustainable Development Goals, many of you aware of that, which began in 2015 and run till 2030. Some of us realized that having these goals was far from enough. In fact, the pushback was that, at least we felt, and I felt, was that when you develop broad goals, policymakers often tend to go for what we sometimes call in America the low-hanging fruit. That is, those who are most able, those who are sort of middle of the spectrum. But could we develop, and do we need to develop, approaches that look very much at what we now call learning at the bottom of the pyramid, a term that wasn't used before? There was a famous business professor who used the term fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, and his goal was to make a lot of money selling to the poor. This was not our goal, and there is sometimes confusion, and I hope you don't share that confusion. We were looking at the fact that most of the research still, but certainly previously, and going way back to my graduate school days, focused on most of the haves of the world, but not on the have-nots, in spite of the fact that the lofty goals say we should work on the marginalized first. But it turns out that it's not easy to do. This is difficult scientifically, it's difficult practically, and it's difficult in terms of policy. So in our first effort on LBOP, learning at the bottom of the pyramid, we actually looked at the scientific dimensions of what does it mean to be doing research on learning at the bottom of the pyramid. Is learning really different for poor people or poor children than it is for wealthier children? That's a question that still has a question mark. But many of us believe that they're not the same. There are differences that go well beyond the biological universalities that exist. We took the second book. The book was just released last week, fortunately, to look at case studies in 4 countries. That's India, Kenya, Ivory Coast, and Mexico, and also some new papers that I think this has created some new opportunities for people to think about the kind of work that needs to be done with marginalized populations that would really make a difference. And so there are papers in their chapters on refugees and migrants, papers on the financing at the bottom of the pyramid, and so on and so forth, and metrics as well. So I think maybe this is posted on the somewhere as a link on the chat. Anyway, just to finish, the work on LBOP continues. Sylvia, just to come back to you, who started me on this, more is yet to come. So I think probably I've used up most of the time, and I can see Amy Jo nodding. So thanks for the opportunity on that topic.
Well, I sincerely hope that more is yet to come, because right now, in the during and post-pandemic era, I think learning at the bottom of the pyramid strategies are especially important. So thank you so much for that, Dan. And we go on to the next questions. Maybe Jo.
Thank you so much, Sylvia and Dan. I think coming out of the pandemic reflections that Sylvia has just mentioned, I think it's impossible to think about learning at the bottom of the pyramid or really anywhere without thinking about technology and education. So I'm going to turn it over now to Nathan Castillo, who will lead us in a little bit of Q&A with Dan around these big ideas in his body of work. Nathan?
Right. Thanks, Amy Jo. Certainly turning to technology and education is an area where Dan and I have done some considerable work together as a student, and continue now as colleagues, advancing new ideas around this. But I want to lead this thematic topic with the question that Ben Piper alluded to in his introduction, in that you were an early proponent of the use of technology for educational development, but you also noted some important limitations. So can you spend some time describing to us an example with your work on Bridges to the Future, for instance, in India and South Africa, and some of its implications for educational technology in low and middle income countries?
Sure, thanks, Nathan. So again, in the 1990s, some of you may remember, those of us old enough to remember that time, there was a thing called the dot-com bubble. That was the beginning of the tremendous growth in both computers and beginning of laptops, the internet, websites, all of that was part of the dot-com bubble. And at that time, there was not just a great expansion of use, not everywhere in the world, there was a lot of inequity in the world, but it was a time that major corporations made a lot of money in the technology area. Of course, there was a dot-com bust, and you'll hear both briefly about both aspects in this in my quick remarks. And at that time, corporations, some of the biggest corporations, had money to spend on trying to make a difference around the world. And amazingly, one of these corporations came to us at Penn and said, we'll give you a whole, I think the word was boatload of money, if you could solve the world's problem of literacy or illiteracy in the world. It seemed like a pretty big challenge, maybe not too big for us at Penn. You know, we're on it. We can do that. How much do you have? And the numbers were in the millions, and life seemed really great. And we got a team together and thought of this idea that eventually became a project that Nathan, you worked on a piece of, which was Bridges to the Future initiative. But in the early heady days, if we had time, I could tell you what that was like. I don't think we have that time today, but just to say, we came up with an idea that was seemingly very simple, but turned out to be hard to implement. And by the time we did our first implementation in India, the dot-com bubble had burst and our millions disappeared, and we had to look for other funders. And that's a bit of a storyline that we may or may not have time to track in this conversation. But just to say that our simple idea was that, and one that is still around today, is that wouldn't it be great if we could teach kids in the language they want to learn in? Simple idea. We've been saying it in CIES for 30, 40 years. Amy Jo's been working on that too. Others in this are nodding their heads. And we thought, well, geez, with technology, that should be easy, because we could get whatever language we want into the computer, have it come out. Kids can choose whichever language they want to learn in. and we could get very localized content and life would be beautiful. And we did that. And life was kind of beautiful while we had the money. And it turned out that we were able to engage in this project in India. We were fortunate to have some high-level Indian government officials who were quite interested at the beginning of the technology. As you know, things have changed in India tremendously, a lot more technology. They're a center of the world and using technology, but in those days, they were just beginning. But nonetheless, they were very excited about the potential of technology. So we developed a multilingual platform, Telugu, Hindi, English, and Urdu in the state of Andhra Pradesh. We rolled this out. It was so popular, we couldn't keep the kids away from these machines. Of course, they'd never had machines before, and we were able to provide them. The results were, however, besides the motivation, we didn't have a large enough sample size or enough time or enough money to carry this through properly, so that we didn't have what we have today in some of these larger scale projects in technology, which is the funds to really do a proper evaluation study. But fortunately, other funders came by. The idea was still a good one, and we were able to move the project to South Africa, to Northern Province. And I don't know if Maseni Dakotla made it onto the call. I know he was planning to be here. I haven't seen his name. But he is head of the NGO that we work with very closely. They're interested in language issues and learning and literacy in South Africa. And there is also where the story intersects with Nathan himself. And Nathan, when I'm done saying another minute here, I'll call on you maybe to say a word more about this, because you did your dissertation on this. Suffice it to say that from my perspective, this project, it shows, I think, my summation is that this Bridge of the Future initiative shows the power of pulling together the best ideas, some of them very simple, with some real possibility in using technology. They can be very compelling. You can design a proof of concept, but when the money runs out, academics are not the best place to house these projects, because the best we can do is publish a piece, try to influence a few people. But in the end, that's an idea that really didn't have the legs that carried forward like it should have. So I don't know, Nathan, can I turn it back to you? Do you have a comment you would like to make on this? We can't hear you.
Yes, certainly. That's a great summation of some of the historical context of EdTech and design and implementation. I think you hit the nail on the head there, so to speak, in terms of how one of the major limitations of working with EdTech is how do we sustain it in a meaningful way? And I think we still haven't solved the piece to that puzzle in a substantive way, which is why we're still trying to understand the connection between technology, learning outcomes, and sustainability and scale, which is a piece that you and I are now working on. So we know that it's important and something that we need to focus on. How to get there is something that we still need to resolve for EdTech. And so certainly this is something that we saw in South Africa, and your account of the historical perspective of opportunities and limitations with EdTech is meaningful. We turn now to hopefully a post-pandemic era. Certainly COVID-19 has made remote learning a feature in homes and schools around the world. Certain limitations still apply there, as well as opportunities. So looking now at a post-pandemic learning perspective and moving forward, what do you see as key obstacles and opportunities for utilizing EdTech and supporting learning in low-income countries?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. And we are, of course, only now coming out of the pandemic. But as we all know who are on this call, everybody on this call probably has experienced changes, even the Zoom call, that have come as a cause of, not that Zoom didn't exist, but the use of it is so much wider. And of course, the use of digital devices for remote learning, platforms, teaching, assessment, schooling, everyday life. It's just incredible what has exploded really in terms of usage and during the pandemic, which was already happening before, but now much more. It's clear that the pandemic, if you've been tracking this in low-income countries, you know that there are examples of teachers being supported to remember with nudges to help them remember when they're supposed to teach phonics and when they're supposed to teach whole word literacy in classes, or nudges for mothers to read to their children at night. These are projects that are ongoing in different countries. There are all kinds of interesting avenues that are being pushed forward. I would say there are a number of major initiatives that did not exist before, as UN agencies, national governments, NGOs, foundations are increasingly involved in trying to use technology in this post-pandemic world. I think we're going to see amazing stuff. But of course, as sort of the academic side of me, sort of related to your question, Nathan, as I see it, there are some real challenges, and you might say obstacles, but I think we can overcome them, but we often don't pay enough attention to them. And I had in my thinking, I have several I'd like to just put on the table very quickly. One is really obvious, and you and I, Nathan, have talked about this a lot, and that is that at least in the last 20 years, most technology, I'd say up into the last 5 years or so, maybe 10, the emphasis has been on device-centric solutions. So people who have iPads, one laptop per child, the internet itself, just since you have a device, let's use it, let's solve the world's problems. This has turned out to be grossly overestimated and often ripe for failure. We could go into the details. I know you could fill in as well. Another limitation is that we often, when I say we, I mean the field of Edtech, people applying technology to education, are often user-centric. And user-centric in not the best way, as I see it. User-centric means what we did at Penn, which is to put computers in university libraries in Ghana and call it a success for giving computers to the poor. Yes, poor country? No. Was it reaching the poor people? No, it was reaching the elites. Even now, a lot of the technology efforts look at high school students learning in English. Are they the people who really need them the most? I don't think so, but it is low-hanging fruit. Am I almost out of time, Amy Jo? Okay. Last point, scale-up centric. Nathan alluded to this. So we're working on a paper now. There's such an emphasis on trying to make solutions to be Uberized, that is, go to scale too quickly, to lower the unit cost, that often we lose track of the bottom of the pyramid. So I'll stop there. We might be able to come back to it. Clearly, one size does not fit all if you're talking about bottom of the pyramid EdTech solutions.
Thanks, Dan, for your thoughts on technology and education. I think we'll move to the final theme now that looks at combining these in partnerships and implementation. And I'll turn it back over to you, Amy Jo.
Thank you so much, Nathan and Dan, for those thoughts. And Mark Ginsberg is adding in the chat issues of corporations monetizing education activity online, possibilities for government, surveillance of those. Lots of issues here. I think we could talk about it all day, but I do want to push on and get to partnerships and implementation, our final theme led by Ben Piper. Ben?
Thanks, Amy Jo. So all of us on the call are coming from some portion of the sector. Dan, you're at a university, so there's other professors here. There's folks like me who are at development or donor agencies. There's NGOs. But I think, Dan, your career has kind of uniquely traversed these different areas. Can you share some thoughts about how you've kind of built up these partnerships and connections across institutions as well as institutional types?
Well, thanks for the question, Ben. And you know, I find that each of these questions provokes so many ideas and so many thoughts. It's difficult to do it in the time that Amy Jo has as or that we simply have. But let me maybe I can be brief. Let me begin with a quick story, short story, and that is that as I was thinking back, one of my first UN experiences was with UNICEF in Yemen. I had recently had my PhD in child development, and somehow UNICEF got my name. They needed somebody who had a PhD in child development, who knew a little bit of Arabic. And I had been to Morocco and I knew a little bit of Arabic, and they invited me to go to Yemen. And I mainly had nothing to offer them. I learned a lot about Yemen. They didn't learn a lot from me. And in a way, when you think about being an academic and working with UN agencies, you do realize this is not a slam dunk. I mean, there is a lot you have to know about what they want, and maybe there's something that you could figure out that they would want. In fact, it did turn out that there were some interesting consequences to that UNICEF visit. But mainly it was a first realization that the world of an academic is not the same world that many UN agencies are living in, and the people who work in them are living in. And so with respect to networking, I think coming back to comments that several people said in the opening today, I don't know exactly how it happened, but I just was interested in these different worlds that people were living in, different worlds of knowledge, different worlds that are out there in the real world itself. And I think, without trying to exaggerate, I just think that one's own training, even a reasonably good graduate training or undergraduate training, there is so much to learn in the world, and we have to get to it. So I did want to say that the language also made a difference. And as I think at least one or two people on the call will know, I made a big effort to learn French. But what I don't often get a chance to say is that one of my reasons for learning French was that my French teacher at the time believed that hitting me on the top of the head with a thick French textbook was the best way to instill motivation in the learner. And obviously that's true, because I did learn to be a pretty good French speaker. And I also learned to speak some other languages along the way. And I say that jokingly, but in fact, it does turn out that meeting people on their own terms, in terms of language, is also important. And maybe one last word on the question you asked, Ben, is that being an academic can depend on where you are. And I was very fortunate that Penn Graduate School of Education tolerated or both my interest in a variety of different activities over time. And indeed, I think they used me in useful ways to expand the global footprint of the university. I see my colleague Nancy Hornberger on here, and I see her smile. And because she and I were conspirators in a positive way around trying to promote the globalization, certainly of education, but even of the university over the years. And lastly on this, and something that may not be so obvious to those who are academics or not academics on this call, is that academics can be, I think a word that a couple of you used, we can be persistent, even if funding drops, such as when I mentioned the Bridges of the Future and Nathan and I working together and the funding disappearing and so on. But academics are in it for a longer haul, and I would say students of academics are in it for an even longer haul most of the time, and they can carry forward these ideas whether there's money or not. And I think that's something that is not often said in a conversation like this, and being within the house of CIES, it's important to say that there are some things academics can actually do pretty well and contribute to the overall efforts we have. We have a bit longer time horizon and maybe a little wider intellectual, sometimes wider intellectual view. I wouldn't say that's at all general, but I'll stop there, Ben.
Thanks, Dan. So speaking of long haul, you've actually had this era of, these eras of your career where you're working as an engineer child development psychology. And then also the last decade or so, where you were the chair for learning and literacy, UNESCO chair for learning and literacy. And I think my first question is kind of about generalized partnerships and how you made them work. I'd just love to hear a little bit more about that particular UNESCO chair and how that's been an important part of your career, and and expanded the applications and implications of your work across the world.
Well, thank you for that. Maybe the most important thing to say is that it was something that didn't happen overnight, even though the decision was made by UNESCO in 2014 to give me that chair at Penn. It actually, my work with UNESCO really has lasted almost 4 decades. And so the UNESCO chair really followed on many of these kinds of activities and partnerships with IAEP and with many different UNESCO offices. I think just since I think we're on a timeline here, let me just say that maybe the most important thing that the chair has done for Penn, and I think, and that means me too, is that it's allowed a special relationship with this very important agency to offer opportunities for our students. More than 100 Penn students, you may not know this, people, more than 100 Penn students have actually interned at different UNESCO offices from Paris to all over the world, regional and national field offices, projects, and so on. That's a lot. I think more than any other current university, as far as I know. Our students have also worked with major NGOs worldwide, RTI, Save the Children, OECD, and other multilateral, and dozens of countries, different NGOs. So the UNESCO chair has been part and parcel of that kind of effort to help our students become more like, what should I say, more like us on this call. They may be academics, but they also may be working in NGOs or in foundations and so on. So being part of UNESCO has really been part of this. And I want to maybe end by also giving a word of credit to UNESCO itself, especially in this time where I think, as Karen opened up and mentioned, Ukraine, which is all on our minds and our prayers. You will have noticed that the UN has played a significant role in the conversations that are taking place in peacemaking efforts. We don't know right now what will be happening, even when we get off of this call, but UNESCO is part of that system. UNESCO is an organization that convenes thought leaders, but it is also part of the international framework in which the UN operates. Now, we haven't been a member for quite a number of years. I hope we will become a member sometime soon. But I think it's important for us to realize, for all of us to realize, that having a relationship with UNESCO, whether the US is a member state or not, for us as academics, is really part of our responsibility. And nobody is perfect. If we didn't have a UNESCO, we would have to create one. If we didn't have the United Nations, we would have to create one. They are essential. And I just want to end with this, this comment that we need them a lot more than they need us, in my view, and we should take this seriously as we go forward. I'm going to stop there, Ben, just in the interest of time.
Thanks so much, Dan. Back to you, Amy Jo.
Yes, and I have a question in the chat asking if we can have a Q&A, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So it is now just my job to say thank you all for joining us, to thank my fellow presenters for sharing your insights and for mostly keeping to time. And most of all, thank you to Dan for your leadership, for your curiosity, for your commitment to all these important issues that we've been discussing, and to all of our learning over your impressive career to date. You get one final word before we hand it to Karen to close, so take it away.
Okay, thanks to all of you. Thanks to CIES. It's been a lifetime of work together with all of you on this call, most of you who I know well, and others I would like to know. And I want to thank each and every one of you on this call, and those who didn't make it onto the call. I hope you can hear my personal gratitude and appreciation for what has been and continues to be bonds of friendship, professional effort and good spirit. Thank you all.
And I wanted to thank Amy Jo for moderating and Dan for sharing his very inspirational thoughts, and to all of you for attending. This session is being recorded and we will post it on the CIES YouTube at some point in the near future. So I wanted to thank everybody, and we'll see you all in April, I hope, at the conference, either in person or virtually.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.